Fellow of the British Academy, one of the Council of Royal Philosophy. He was the Dean of Trinity Hall, Cambridge, and Professor of Philosophy of Religion at King's College London, and then Emeritus Professor of Divinity at Oxford. He's published numerous books, perhaps the one most relevant to today's talk, Big Questions in Science and Religion. He's now a professorial research fellow at King's College London. So Keith, inviting you to speak to us.
So I've been given two titles, one at the beginning of the day and one at the end, and I don't know what's going to happen in the middle. So what I say at the end of the day will depend on what's happened before that. So don't take the titles too seriously. I will be talking about new atheism, and I will be talking about the big questions in science and religion, but those are very vague titles, so I've got to be selective in that. And I will start off by talking about some of the names which are quite well known in the new atheism. So that's backwards, really, according to the day. And I would have thought new atheism would be dead by now, and it's certainly not new, but I suppose it was associated mostly with Richard Dawkins, really. And what was new about it was simply that he was very aggressive and indeed dismissive of both Christian faith, religion in general, and philosophy. So all of them are just worth nothing as far as he's concerned. I would have thought that had died out now. I talk to sixth formers in schools quite a lot, and they're getting fed up with Richard Dawkins, thank goodness. And they do see that he's exaggerating his case tremendously. And I would have thought it had died out, but it hasn't. Probably the philosopher who's best known in England is A.C. Grayling, because he writes newspaper articles. And he's just come out with a book called The God Problem, which again is the same sort of dismissive thing about religion. He's a philosopher, I mean, he's a genuine philosopher, and he still holds, which I think is a completely anti-philosophical remark, that believing in God is equivalent to believing in fairies at the bottom of the garden. And that anybody who studies theology are people who are on a par with people who study astrology. So, as I'm a professor of theology, I find that rather annoying, really. And so I want to ask the question, well, how on earth can people come to that opinion? It's a peculiar opinion within the history of philosophy and theology. Well, let's take philosophy, because that's supposed to be more neutral. You know, it's not. I mean, philosophers are much more prejudiced than theologians in my experience, but in different ways probably. But let's pretend philosophy is a more neutral subject. And in the history of philosophy in the West, virtually every classical philosopher has believed in God or something very like God. So Plato believed in the good, the supreme good. Aristotle certainly believed in God. He wasn't a creator. God didn't create the universe, but there was a supremely good God, worthy of admiration and possessing all good virtues and properties. And then you go through the list of philosophers, and even apart from people like Aquinas and Anselm and so on, Descartes, Kant, Hegel, almost every philosopher you found on a philosophy syllabus in a university did believe in God. I'm just saying that to make the point that it doesn't sound as though these were all people who believed in fairies and that they were doing astrology. There's much more intellectual weight behind it than that. And I suppose it's true that the rise of science in its modern form makes a difference to how you interpret scripture and how you interpret Christian faith. And I think that's true. And certainly when the Bible was written, people had no idea at all of how vast the universe was and how long it had existed and how long it would continue to exist. So there's been a vast expansion of horizons, though why that should cause people to doubt the existence of God, I don't know. It just makes God more amazing than one ever had thought that God was. But it has an effect. I mean, if you're going to say Christ is the final revelation of God, and Christ shows us what the purpose of God is, then you're going to say, well, this human person on one very small, almost peripheral planet is somehow the center of God's purpose for the universe. Is that any longer credible? And that's one of the major problems between Christianity and the scientific worldview is, aren't we just peripheral? And, well, we don't know whether we are or not. We're peripheral, as it were, physically. Whether there are other alien life forms, I have no idea. Perhaps Dr. Bussey will have an idea, but I don't. But I wouldn't be surprised if there were other life forms. I'd rather hope there are. Why should God's creative endeavours be confined to people like us, or to people at all? But that will, if that's an expansion of horizons, it does mean that the way we think about Christian faith has to be revised slightly. Let me give you an obvious implication of this. We talk about God, I think rightly. When I say we are Christians, I might not all be Christians, but it's Christians in science, this, isn't it? So I'm just going to say we for Christians. That'll make a change in my life, I can tell you. So we do think that God is Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, if you think about that, it reminds me of going around Amsterdam Cathedral with someone whose English wasn't perfect, and he was showing me things in the cathedral, and he said, and there's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Bird. So you can see that there are problems about what metaphors you use for God. They are metaphors. God is not a father, genetically speaking. But if you talk about Father and Son, you're talking about human beings, really. You're talking about organisms which reproduce by sexual methods. And that's the metaphor, Father. And you think, well, probably if there are other worlds and other beings on other worlds, they wouldn't have fathers there, so the term father wouldn't make any sense. So you'd have to use some other term for that. Son, too, obviously a male offspring. Perhaps that wouldn't exist in other forms of life. And certainly pigeons or doves wouldn't exist. So Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, those terms would be different. I'm not saying there wouldn't be a Trinitarian, a threefold sense of God, but you wouldn't use those terms. So Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are very human. If you look at churches, especially in medieval times, you even get pictures of God. I think that's rather disgraceful, personally, but you do. And Michelangelo's picture of God in the Sistine Chapel is, of course, a very obviously human person. And I think that's a great limitation of imagination. And science should expand that enormously. And if we're going to have pictures of heaven any longer in a scientific world, we're not going to have it full of human beings. So even angels look human, but they've got wings. They're going to be very different things altogether. And this is not really a surprisingly new thing. Some very ancient theologians, like Tertullian in particular, who's my favourite in this regard, said, what will the resurrection life be like when we're raised from death by God? What will we be like? And Tertullian said, well, we'll be always spherical. We'll be perfectly spherical. As one of my American colleagues said, we're working on it. But the reason that people will be spherical is because that's the perfect shape. And why should they have limbs and look like us? You know, what age are we going to be resurrected at? Is one of the questions Thomas Aquinas raised. He raised every question you could think of, really. So at what age would you be resurrected? And Aquinas' answer was 33. That's what age you'd be resurrected. I think it's a good age to be. It's maturity. Jesus died at that age. That was his main theological reason. But you're going to have to grow up pretty quickly if you died as young, or if you died very old, you're going to shrink very quickly, or expand, or whatever you do at the age of 33. So these questions are real questions, and science is relevant to giving answers. Are humans the one centre of the universe? In my own Church of England, and in my own liturgy, we actually have a phrase prophets occasionally, humans are the crown of creation, and I always object to that. I always say no, but nobody takes any notice. Are human beings the crown of creation? That's a very interesting question. Why should they be? Well, yes, Jesus was God incarnate. I have no doubt of that. But why should Jesus, a human person, be the only form in which the infinite God can take, well, flesh in our case, but take silicon or take some other form of possible organic and sentient life? Why not? So, to say we're the crown of creation strikes me as just too myopic, too short-sighted. So one thing science has done is to expand horizons and say you don't have to think that we are the centre of the universe. because, as theologians have usually said, every place for God is a centre of God's attention. God being infinite doesn't have to say, oh, I'm too busy at the moment, I'm concerned with things on Alpha Centauri. You can say, no, whatever God is able to play absolutely intense, proper and appropriate attention to every place in the universe. So I would say one lesson of science straight away is humanity is not particularly important in the scale of the universe. There were, of course, billions of years of universe without any humans, and that wasn't just a waste of time. And you say, why did it exist? Well, one reason you could give as a believer why it exists is that God actually enjoyed it, and God created it because it was good to watch. And in fact, when there weren't organic life forms, there was no suffering, so we didn't have the problem of evil. You can have supernovae, and they're not evil, they're beautiful from God's point of view. They're not killing anything, if there's nothing there to kill. So the universe was much better before human beings came along, in fact. So the question, what was God doing before there were human beings, is God was enjoying things much more. And the universe could be just appreciated for its beauty. And you can appreciate the question, why on earth did God create human beings? Because it messed everything up. Well, there were other points about the existence of humans, no doubt. But again, I think you shouldn't think that humans have to be the centre of God's purpose. Maybe if you ask the great theological question, why did God create the universe? Now, let me just pause to ask, is that a scientific question? Is it a question? There are philosophers, colleagues of mine, who say it's not even a question, it doesn't make sense, it's silly really. But I think it does make sense. You say, if there is a God, if there is a mind-like being, a conscious being that creates the universe, what purpose could it have in creating the universe? And some people can't see any purpose, and I know that Steven Weinberg has famously said that the more he understands of the universe, the less it makes any sense and the less purpose it could ever have. And I think that's just plain wrong, actually. If you say, what purpose could this universe have? Well, its beauty, its grandeur, its majesty is enough purpose, that's it. It's just worthwhile to have a universe as rational, as intelligible, as beautiful as this universe is. You don't need human beings. But you do, of course, need somebody to appreciate that beauty and that grandeur and to understand it. And that's where things like human beings come in. So I want to talk in Christian faith not about humans, but about persons, about beings which are conscious and able to understand and appreciate the grandeur of the universe. And I think it's pretty obvious you could say a God could create a universe. It would be a good purpose in creating a universe to create beings who could understand and appreciate, together with God, the grandeur of God's universe. And to appreciate and understand something about God too. That would be worthwhile. So if you're asking about purpose, and here's a central question, is there purpose in the cosmos? I think you're talking not about a scientific approach, but about an axiological approach. And that's the big distinction I want to make in this first talk this morning, between a scientific explanation or what you might call a nomological explanation. That's a law-like explanation, an explanation in terms of laws of nature, and that's what science ideally does, tries to get laws of nature. So distinguish between that nomological explanation and axiological explanation, from the Greek axia, meaning value, an explanation in terms of value. When Richard Dawkins wrote his book, whatever it was called, he said, he actually put me in the book. I was in the book, I was quite pleased. I thought, oh, I'm famous at last, I'm in Richard Dawkins' book. And, but what he said about me was this: Ward, like Swinburne, another religious character, doesn't understand what an explanation is. So I thought, well, that's odd. I wonder what it is. So I read on. And he just thought an explanation was a scientific explanation. That was it. There's nothing other than a scientific explanation. In fact, that view has been repeated in Stephen Hawking's recent book, The Grand Design. I don't know if anybody's read that. Have anybody read that, The Grand Design? By Stephen, yes, obviously, by Stephen Hawking. Anyway, it's a nice little book, but it's extremely provocative. But it is what Stephen Hawking apparently thinks. And in that he says, on page 1 of the book, philosophy is dead. It's dead. On page 40 he says, my philosophy is... something's gone wrong somewhere. But it does raise the question, are there any non-scientific proper questions and any ways of tackling things from an academic and rational point of view which are not scientific? And I think there are, and that Dawkins is absolutely wrong when he says there's only one sort of explanation, and that's in terms of scientific laws. And I'll try, be very interested to know your responses to this, but I'll try to make the distinction between scientific or nomological explanation and axiological explanation. A scientific sort of explanation, an ideal scientific sort of explanation, of course lots of different sciences, they're all different, but an ideal is that you would actually be able to measure things. It's very difficult to have science without measurement. So you have to be able to put a precise value on something, have some scale of precise measurement. So you have to be talking about measurable phenomena. And of course, not all phenomena are measurable. Thoughts are not measurable. You can't measure thoughts. You can measure brain states and electrochemical activity in the brain, but you can't measure thoughts. So if there are any things which are not measurable, science is going to have difficulty in coping with that. I mean, you can see that in alleged sciences like economics, you even have difficulty in saying how you could measure anything. How do you measure happiness? This is very fashionable these days, measuring happiness. Strikes me as an absurd thing to do. You know, how happy am I today? Well, 5.9 at the moment. It doesn't make sense. You say, right, I can be more or less happy, but I can't place a measurement on happiness. So that all seems a terrible waste of money really to do that. That's just one of my hobby horses really. You shouldn't have a happiness index. I think you need £22,000 a year to be maximally happy. Just according to the Guardian. Anyway, absurd really. So are there measurable things? For a scientific explanation, yes, you need measurement. They need to be quantitative in some way. They need to be law-like. That is to say, things need to happen in accordance with some law. Law of gravitation is the paradigm, of course, and you can state it exactly. Ideally, it should be mathematically expressible. That's very important. Mathematical expression is important. So if there are any things which aren't law-like, economics is one of them, by the way, then they're not really going to be scientific. If economics, if you're really keen on that being a science, well, take philosophy. That's certainly not law-like. Or things that happen in ordinary everyday life aren't law-like. There are some regularities, but odd things happen, and things that you can't expect. That's why history is not a science, really, because things happen far too individualistically in history for you to make any laws of history. And if you're trying to find God, there are certainly no laws in accordance with which God works. And of course, another thing you need in science, as well as measurability and law-likeness and mathematical expressibility, is predictability. Preferably, you'd like to be able to predict what's going to happen in the future. That follows from law-likeness, probably. And you want to be able to do experiments. That's very important. You have to have repeatable experiments. So everybody will agree, in principle, if they can learn the subject, they know how to agree on the results of an experiment. So repeatable experiments are very important. That's a slight ideal in science, but still it's there. Measurability, predictability, the ability to repeat experiments and to give a mathematical, precise prediction of what's going to happen. So that's a scientific explanation. Now, of course, there is such a thing, and it's great, it's fantastic, and it has revolutionized our thinking about the world. That's true. But the question is that the only form of explanation there is? It's really a form of what philosophers call the verification principle. You must be able to verify by sense experience something that's happening. This has become rather complicated in quantum physics, but you would like to be able to verify. So even if you don't know quite how to, I mean, when physicists talk about superstrings, I believe, talking to one or two of them, that they don't know quite how to verify it. But they would like to verify it, and they think it would be nice if you could verify it. So it's something they want to be able to do. So verification is an ideal, even if you can't actually get it. Now, is verification so important in religion? Well, that's a question, or in lots of other things too. So let's now, having made that rather peremptory definition of what a scientific explanation might be, or a paradigm case, an exemplary case of a scientific explanation, what other sort of explanation might there be? Well, what I proposed is the term axiological explanation. And I think that's a proper form of explanation. Whether or not it's reducible to scientific explanation is a key question in philosophy. But it doesn't look as though it's reducible, and I'll just say it's not. Nobody's ever done it anyway. To reduce it would be to translate all your axiological explanations into scientific explanations. Nobody's ever done it, nobody knows how to do it, but somebody would like to be able to do it. It would be a reductive explanation. So what is axiological explanation? Well, it's explanation of something happening for the sake of bringing about some value. That's why axiology comes in. You're aiming at value. Without the notion of value, you can't have an axiological explanation. In most sciences, value doesn't come into it. It doesn't come into the science itself. You just dispassionately say, this is what happens, but you don't say, and it's a good thing. That's not part of the science. That's a value judgment. It's good or it's bad. So axiology deals with values, and the fact that we're sitting in this room this morning is partly to be explained in terms of the fact that we thought, some of us, or all of us, thought it would be of some value to be here. We didn't ask about how our electrons were all going to get here. We actually just said, well, I think that would be a good thing, and I'm going to do it for that reason. So acting for a reason, that's axiology. And if that's a form of explanation, I came because I thought I would be able to think more about Christianity and faith. You'll say, I came because of that. I had an idea, and that idea caused me to come here. And I don't know what the science of that is. I've got no idea. I presume there is some. But whether or not there is some, that's still an explanation. Right? So it's not explaining every aspect of why you're here, but it's, without it, you're missing the most important reason why you're here. So all the talk about how your electrons actually got to be in this place failed to give you a reason. They don't mention a reason at all. And that's why I think axiological explanation is different. There are four aspects of an axiological explanation. The first one is knowledge. Knowledge of a future state. You envisage a person who does something for the sake of learning or being happy or pleasure or whatever it is. A person who acts for the sake of something else envisages a future state. Now that's a very remarkable thing. In philosophy it's called intentionality with an S, but it's not a universally used expression, so I wouldn't worry much about that. But intentionality is that if you have a brain state, you have a mental state, then there's one aspect of it which is purely physical. That is, you just state what actually exists in the mind or the brain at this moment. And you can give a description of that. But then there's a property of that brain state which is reference to the future. So if I think about what I'm going to be doing tomorrow, I'm thinking about what is happening in a future state. And you cannot give a present physical description which includes that thinking about a future state. Right? I mean, that's a profound mystery, so you may disagree, but even if you disagree, you have to agree it's a profound mystery upon which people really disagree. So it's not settlable by science, that's my point. Some things are settlable in principle by science, but what it is to think, to have a brain state which is a present state, whose present description includes a reference to a future state which hasn't happened yet. There's no physical explanation of how that can happen. That it's called, you could call that aboutness. I'm thinking about something. Could be something non-existent, like a unicorn. Could be something future, which doesn't exist yet. It could be something which doesn't exist. I can think of impossible things, like the highest prime number. But I'm still thinking about those things. So what physical description can you give of that? You can't. Aboutness is an irreducibly non-describable state. You can say it occurs. It's a mental state, in other words. It's a characteristic of mental states. So you think about the future. That's the first bit of axiology. You can't have thinking about value without thinking about a possible future state. So knowledge of things which don't exist. Right. Secondly, you need to have an evaluation of that possible future state. So you have a set of possible states you can envisage, which can be envisaged. The point, these are possible states, they're not actual states, and you're envisaging them. So the actual state is an envisaging of lots of possible states. And that's the non-physical state, right, that bit about. It's about non-physical states. And you evaluate them. That is, you say some of them I would choose, some of them I wouldn't choose. I'm going to do this, I'm not going to do that. You're evaluating the states. That's the second element of it, evaluation. The third is you start to do something which brings about that state. So you say, I want to go to a day conference on this. I will actually go and get in my car and do it. So you think that you're doing something because you want to achieve an envisaged future state which you evaluate positively. So that intentional action. However, the scientist, this is irrelevant. The scientific description is irrelevant to your deciding to do this. You might have no idea what science is involved in this, but you still do it because you want the future state. That's the third element, intentional action. And the fourth element is enjoying the thing. You actually enjoy, you could say, you get pleasure from, or you appreciate the state when it exists, you hope. And again, enjoyment and appreciation are mental states. So these are four characteristic sorts of mental states. And I'm saying they are not amenable to scientific analysis. That is the sort of explanation that I gave as a scientific explanation. Because no mental state is measurable. No mental state is one on which you can carry out experimental, repeatable experiments. That's incorrect, as I've just expressed it. But what I mean is you cannot carry out repeatable experiments on people who are wondering what to do in the future, deciding what to do and setting about to do it. You can't do that. You could do it in the most general terms, like saying people will aim at things that give them pleasure. Yes, it's a very general term. That's not scientific, it's just too vague. It's a generalization. It's hand-waving, as people say. And also, of course, it can turn out to be wrong. And you wouldn't be surprised if it did turn out to be wrong. People can do things that go against Adam Smith's predictions about everybody will act in their rational self-interest. Well, they don't. They don't. People are stupid. So you can never allow for stupidity. And I myself have caught myself doing things because they're irrational. And I say, well, bloody hell, I'm just going to do it. I know it's irrational. I'm still going to do it. Why do people act like that? That's original sin, I expect. I've got no idea. But people do. So human conduct is really something in its mental aspects that seems to evade scientific explanation. Let me give you a simple example. It's a very simple one. Dreaming. You dream about something. Let's say last night, this is not, it might be true, I'm not going to tell you whether it's true or not. Last night I dreamt I was in the Bahamas. It's significant that I'm not going to tell you whether it's true or not, because I want to say that I know, I'm absolutely certain that I dreamt I was in the Bahamas. And you can say to me, how can you be certain? You were asleep after all. You can't possibly be certain. And I have philosophical colleagues who say that people don't actually dream, they just wake up believing they dreamt. And it's very difficult to decide whether they're right or not. You say, no, I can prove I'm dreaming. Well, how? Well, I'll wake you up and ask you. You say, that's no good. You've woken up and you've got the belief that you had a dream. I want to know if you're dreaming while you're dreaming. You say, well, I can see your rapid eye movements. Well, what's that got to do with it? You just say you're having a dream. There's a correlation between having rapid eye movements and waking up believing you had a dream. That's true. But you can't ever check that you are actually having a dream. You just, when you wake people up, they say they were having a dream. So I knew that. That's not what I'm interested in. Were you actually having a dream? My tutor in philosophy long ago was Gilbert Ryle. He wrote a book called The Concept of Mind. He didn't believe there were any mental events. There were no private mental events. You couldn't, for example, close your eyes and envisage Big Ben. Have a picture of Big Ben. Because there was nowhere to have the picture. You see, it was only the physical brain. Big Ben's not in your physical brain. So you can't be having a picture. So I'd sit there saying, I'm having a picture of Big Ben. He said, no, you're not. You can't be. Because there are no mental events, he said. And he said that to his dying day. Well, nearly to his dying day. And then he said, well, there might be. But anyway, so philosophers can be very, hard-minded if they want to be, and say there are no mental events. And of course the view that there are no mental events is generally called materialism in philosophy, and that's the enemy of faith. That really is the enemy of faith. Materialism, there are no mental events which are in principle undetectable by anybody else. And here's the point. You will never know whether I really dreamt about the Bahamas last night. That's a completely unverifiable statement. But I know it's true. You don't. I do. I know whether it's true or not. So the verification principle that you must be able to test every statement you make cannot be true. And we all know it cannot, because we have lots of mental events that we never tell anybody else about. Now, the existence of spies corroborates this, that a successful spy will never be found out. And they will always believe the opposite of what they tell everybody else. And they successfully convince everybody else that they do believe the opposite of what they actually believe. But only they know what they actually believe. Maybe one other person whom they've probably killed. Right? So if spying is possible, then it's possible to have private mental events. Now, this is a very important topic for religion, because of course knowledge of God, experience of God, is a private mental event. That is, nobody else knows whether you've had one or not. And even if they agree you've had something you claim to be an experience of God, they'll never know whether it was authentic, whether it was genuine or not. And the real problem is neither will you often. Right? So you can have an experience of God and not be quite sure whether it was genuine or not. I remember when I was quite young, God has very rarely spoken to me. I mean, I've very rarely heard words, actually words formed in my mind which I thought came from God, but it happened on one occasion. And God said something I didn't like, these words formed in my mind, and I decided that it was actually indigestion. I've paid for that. Anyway, so you've got that question. There are other explanations of all these mental events. That is true, there are. So in that sense, you can't be theoretically certain, but they might be genuine. And often you believe strongly that they are. So go back to the dreaming case just for a moment, and it's worse than saying you don't know what I dreamt about. It's worse than that. Even I am not able to verify that I dreamt about the Bahamas, even though I know that I did. And I would seriously claim I know things that I am unable to verify. I couldn't ever verify them, because I can't get back into my dream, I can't repeat it, I can't ever be certain, theoretically. I couldn't prove to anybody else that I really did have that dream, but I know that I did. So the verification principle cannot possibly be true. So the verification principle meaning a statement in its strong sense. A statement only really makes sense and should only be believed if you could, in principle, if anybody could know, there was some way in which they could know that it was true. I think dreaming is the most obvious case, but it's only one of millions of cases where that is simply not true, and nobody, not even you, can verify that you really did have a dream. And so the parallel with religion is not even you can actually verify that you have experienced the presence of Christ, but you can certainly believe that, and it's reasonable to believe that you have. So it's reasonable for you to believe, and I think people, whether they're Christians or not, would usually agree with this and say it is reasonable to believe many things that you couldn't ever prove to anybody else, and you couldn't even prove to yourself. You can't establish them. So that's different from a scientific truth. The scientific truth has to be publicly verifiable. It has to be experimentally repeatable in principle, anyway. Whereas in the case of experiences of God and religious experiences, that's not true. It is not true at all. And of course, to try to experimentally repeat an experience of God would actually be something very like blasphemy. You know, you say to God, look, I'm going to carry out an experiment on you. Would you mind just keeping still for a bit and don't breathe? And I'm going to try to see if it works. Okay, raise that table 5 feet in the air. I mean, just what's wrong with that is it's irreligious. It's testing God, putting God to the test. And that's forbidden. And it's not forbidden because you just fail to verify such things, so that's what Richard Dawkins says. You know he's not going to do it, so you don't carry out the experiment. It's because there is something wrong. It's not a religious activity at all to ask God to do things, to show that God is there. That's not... It's like asking God, I know some Christians do, but it's like asking God to get them a parking space in Sainsbury's. And, to do that is deeply un-Christian, because you should be asking God to get everybody else a parking space. There you are. But it's funny how Christians become selfish at the last minute. Just one parking space. So there are deep similarities between mental experiences, conscious experiences, and religious experiences. Religious experiences are one form of conscious experience. And this leads to the fundamental, I think, the most fundamental distinction between scientific and religious elements of experience, that scientific experiences have to be publicly repeatable and observable and verifiable. And religious experiences can't be. Not just, the reason I talk about dreams is because it's not just religious experiences, it's a lot of experiences that you have that are not concerned with physical reality. Like, I think the content of a dream is not a physical reality. Of course there are states of the brain which are occurring while you're having the dream, but actually even if you hook you up to the most complicated machine that you could think of, it's not going to tell you what you're dreaming about. I don't think anybody's got anywhere near getting to that state yet. So there is a big division between materialism, which says nothing exists except physically observable, physically existent things, and that's all that exists, and the opposite of materialism, which is in philosophy called idealism. Now, I would say that all religions are idealistic in their intellectual backgrounds, but you mustn't interpret the word idealism too narrowly. A lot of people, when they hear the word idealism, think about particular philosophers like Hegel in particular, and people who had views which are not Christian and which are written in very obscure language, etc. You think of particular philosophers. I'm not doing that. Although most philosophers have been idealists, I'm using the word idealist in a very broad sense. In this sense, idealists believe that the ultimate reality, the most real thing, and ultimately the only real thing on which everything else depends, is more mind-like or consciousness-like than matter-like. In other words, mind logically is prior to matter. So I'm not saying that matter doesn't exist at all. Right? Idealists don't, on the whole, say that. They do say, as Plato, the first idealist, first well-known one, said, that matter is an appearance of mind. So idealists would make a distinction, the big philosophical distinction between appearance and reality. Now, I think scientists have to do that as well, actually. I think that, especially when you're talking about quantum physics, but not only that, you have to say the reality, what exists, is very different from what appears to us. The most obvious example is that people of my acquaintance tell me, when they've had about 4 pints of beer, that reality consists of 11-dimensional waggling superstrings, which are colourless and without extension, and there they are. So I just accept this and say, have another pint. See if you can get a few more dimensions, and yes, indeed, they can. So you say, but the world appears to me to be three-dimensional, with time not really being a dimension, actually, as far as experience is concerned, but three dimensions go along in time, and things in 3 dimensions are solid and coloured, and we know what that's like. And these colleagues say, no, reality is not like that. That's what is constructed by your organs of perception, your brain mechanisms, etc. It's a construct. So you can make the difference within science very easily in physics between what is there in visual terms, electromagnetic vibrations of certain wavelengths which are not coloured at all, coloured wouldn't exist there, and what appears to us in our consciousness, which is lots of coloured objects. So our consciousness constructs the world of appearance. That doesn't mean it's a fiction, but it's a construction. And that's what an idealist thinks, that the mind or the brain, I'm being neutral there, but consciousness constructs the world that appears to us. And science is very anti-common sense. Science does not believe this common sense world. But people, when atoms were first seriously posited in science, there were many scientists who refused to believe they existed because they're not ordinarily observable. We found ways, of course, of observing them now, but when we didn't have those ways, the world doesn't look as though it's made up of little atoms at all. It doesn't look like that. So Aristotelian physics, which was based on observation, didn't believe in atoms. It believed in forms and forces and purposes, etc. And once you believe things are made up of very small, and they thought indivisible particles, that was a different view of the world. So what I want to stress here is that the scientific view of the world is not the common sense view of the world. It's the opposite of common sense. So anybody who tries to do quantum physics and stick to common sense is in for a hard time. You're not really going to be able to do it. So the scientific view of the world does not start from common sense, and it doesn't stay with common sense. How does it exist? Well, because it is, of course, subject to experimental and repeatable confirmation, that's true, but mostly because it's an elegant mathematical construct. And I certainly I'm technically, if you want to know, an operationalist, but it doesn't matter about that. What I think is, I agree with Niels Bohr, in other words, on this, that when quantum physicists talk about wavelengths and wave functions and use numbers like the square root of -1, for example, then you can't answer the question, what do these numbers correspond to? Square root of -1 doesn't correspond to anything, but it's very important in many quantum calculations. So you say, well, what's it about then? And you say, it's an operation. It's a mathematical operation. Just as there's nothing that corresponds to minus, this is an operation that you perform. It's misleading to ask the question, what does it correspond to? You know, Bertrand Russell, as a philosopher, believed that every mathematical expression corresponded to something, that every word in language had to correspond. And he agonized about what does the word if correspond to. So you say table is, well, that, or whatever this is. Microphone is that. So what's the word if stand for? And he had this view, language, words stand for things. You see. So what does the word if stand for? And after months of agonizing, he decided the word if stands for a slight feeling of hesitation. But it obviously doesn't, because it doesn't matter whether you hesitate or not if you use the word if. So he was just barking up the wrong tree completely. So words don't have to correspond to things. And I think, personally, that the mathematical expressions in quantum physics don't have to correspond to things. And that's a very misleading question to ask. But, of course, there is something that they're about. And if you ask, well, what is the reality that they're about, I think all that a person like me can say is that they're not about common sense reality anyway. They're about phenomena that happen under very tightly constrained experimental conditions, and the phenomena that such things happen is indisputable, but how to interpret them is something nobody's managed to do yet. Nobody's managed to interpret them. And you don't need to interpret them, you just do the maths. You know. It was Richard Feynman who said, if anybody tells you that they understand quantum physics, they're lying. So that makes me feel better for a start. Well, I'm just making the point here that sometimes people think that somehow science and common sense go together, whereas faith doesn't go together with science, right? So you've got the alliance on the one side, science and common sense, and on the other side, you've got faith, and they're quite different from each other. And I think that's totally wrong. Both faith and science are opposed to common sense. They're not about what's common sense at all. They're about what's true, which is different. Common sense doesn't tell you the truth. Common sense is very unreliable. We are not solid three-dimensional objects, really. That's how we appear. We are different beings. And here's where you get the two main theoretical interpretations of experienced reality. Let me just remind you about the traditional British philosophy, which is often used as an argument against faith, but actually is more disposed towards faith than against. It's one of the ironies of modern discourse that things which actually support faith are thought to not support them. So let me give you an example. Traditional British philosophical thought is empiricist. It's empiricist. That, in the words of Locke, Berkeley and Hume, you start from perceptions, what they call ideas. You have sense perceptions, and you base all your knowledge on sense perceptions. So all the motto of empiricism is all knowledge begins with experience. And if you're a radical empiricist, you think that's where all knowledge stops. All knowledge stops with experience. But it turns out this is very uncommonsensical. You see, it sounds commonsensical. You say, oh yeah, that's right, you have experience, and that's obviously true, and that's where your knowledge begins. But when you ask the empiricist philosophers what they mean by experience, they don't mean experience of a world of physical objects. They mean that all your knowledge begins from sense perceptions, sights, sounds, touches, etc., and your mind puts these together and interprets them as experience of an objective world of three-dimensional objects. It's not what you actually see. So empiricism is not commonsensical, it's very uncommonsensical. A.J. Ayer, one of the most famous empiricists in the 20th century, said that the physical world, the world of physical objects, is a construct out of sense data, that is experiences, sights, sounds, colours, etc. So the physical world is not what you directly see. Now the point I'm making here is that it's wrong to associate science with common sense. Science shouldn't be associated with that, it should be associated with a theoretical interpretation, a very sophisticated and wonderful one, of what appearances tell you. So you've got to refer back to appearances, but what you're interested in is the elegant theoretical schemes which you are so invested in that you won't mind if you can't quite make them coherent. So, as you know, quantum theory is not coherent actually with relativity theory. I mean, there are great contradictions that nobody can resolve, but nobody worries about that I've ever met. They just say, well, we just leave that for another day. You know. And one day we may get a totally coherent, but they both work in their own realm, and that's what we want. They're good theoretical explanations. Well, what I'm wanting to suggest is that in faith in God, experience of God, experience of Christ as the Saviour from sin, experience of growing unity with God through the Holy Spirit, that sort of experience. That is real and true experience, but it's an interpretation of things which appear to you in certain ways. So it's a theoretical explanation of your experiences, but in a different way. It's non-materialistic, it's idealistic. You explain your experience in terms of mental realities. God, Christ, glorified Christ. So a mental reality, living in a non-material realm. So there's the ultimate, I think, distinction. It's not a contradiction, it's just two different sorts of interpretation of experience. I've called them the axiological and the nomological. You could also say the idealist and the materialist. Now, so many people today, I'm in my last 2 minutes, so many people today associate science with materialism. And then they mistakenly think that that is the same as common sense. So science is founded on straightforward observation, whereas faith isn't. And those are all completely wrong interpretations. And things like quantum physics ought to support religion by showing that those interpretations are wrong. Quantum physics shows that science is not about common sense, and it contradicts common sense, and that doesn't matter. Then it actually survives because it's a particular theoretical interpretation. So what you're left with is the question, is a materialist interpretation the best interpretation of your experience? That it's really experience of things which are just purely physical. And I'll end by saying, why should you have such a limited view of the sorts of things that can exist? There is absolutely no reason to think, and it's even rather silly to think, that nothing exists except material things. In fact, let me end with a quotation from Stephen Hawking, which proves that that view is false from his point of view, and that is, the whole of the material universe, space-time, originates from a realm beyond space-time, i.e. a non-material realm. He calls it the quantum vacuum, but let's not bother about that. The main thing to remember about a quantum vacuum is it's the opposite of nothing. So, very full of all sorts of things like quantum laws and various sorts of gravitational inflationary energy, etc. But the whole point is, he's not saying that matter is what things are ultimately made of. In fact, his own view of what things are ultimately made of is what's called M theory, which is nothing like what we think of as solid stuff in 3 dimensions. So I think quantum physics actually shows materialism is false, but the real crucial question is not that, but isn't idealism an interpretation which is truer to all our experience, and especially if you've got an experience of faith, that you do have knowledge and direct encounter with non-physical realities. They're mediated through the physical, but they are not confined to the physical. So your knowledge may begin with experience, but that experience takes you beyond the world of appearance to the world of reality. And I think as Christians, I would say we believe that the ultimate reality is the mind of God, who knows, who wills, who loves, and in that respect is a mind, but so much more than a mind, and is not material. And that's where the ultimate question is science conducive to materialism? I'll just leave you with the thought that it actually is in tension with materialism, and is, insofar as it's theoretical physics, for example, and mathematical, it's much more conducive to a spiritual view of the universe than to a material one. But time is up, so I will open up to questions.
So we have 20 minutes for questions. So questions. No, sorry, I haven't got a microphone. If you
I met somebody the other year ago who said that they met some UFO people, aliens, they were taken up, and they met people from outer space and so on. They actually believed this really intensely. And a couple of months ago, we met somebody who was crossing the common in Southampton who said he saw Jesus and went up and spoke to them. To them, these are intensely real experiences. You can't verify them, but for them, they were real. To what extent are you able to say that these things, if you want to, I don't know how you define the real, they are experienced intensely as being real to them?
Yeah.
How would you go about saying maybe they're not real to the rest of the community, or are you just discounting them, or do we accept that they're as real as we experience in this room?
Right.
What's your test if there's no verification?
Well, there are some tests. I mean, clearly, you would immediately say they're false, so you must have a test that you're working with. Right. And your test is, well, do all people have that sort of experience? Or is the way that we understand the physical world such that there are UFOs flying around the place and this could have happened? In other words, you have a probability scheme which relies on background beliefs which make their beliefs very improbable. So you have to ask the question, where does your probability scheme come from? And I think I really would say here, I'm postmodern as they say, to this extent. There is no neutral probability scheme. So if you say, what is the world ultimately like? Are there aliens flying around the universe? But you ask simple questions like, why haven't we seen them? Is it all a conspiracy? Have the Americans just prevented you having any information? And it becomes very improbable to say that this will happen. Right? So if you believe there are fairies in the bottom of the garden, there are people who do, people who've taken photographs of them. But you ask the question, well, why I try to see fairies, I fail to do it, why doesn't that happen? So you ask, how intelligent are people? What are their beliefs about the universe in general? Do they seem to me to be true? You can't get away from that element of subjectivity. Do they seem to me to fit into how I think the universe is? Miracles are a good example of that. If you have a view of scientific law, according to which scientific laws can't be broken, then miracles are never going to seem probable to you. And a materialist like Dawkins, who does have such a view of scientific law, would simply discount any claim to miracles. And you can't do anything about that. You say, well, if his view of scientific law is correct, that's going to seem improbable to him. So you're stuck with that. So you do have the question that I haven't dealt with, is God probable? And if I've hinted that God is very probable, but I haven't proved it at all. So it'll depend on that. And if you think God is probable, you've got to say, I'm going to give a certain initial credibility to claims to have seen God. But if I think that UFOs don't exist, for lots of different connected reasons, that's going to seem very improbable to me, but still very puzzling. So you mustn't take the experience in isolation. That's the bottom line.
So if you've got axiological and non-logical questions, or how and why questions, the four aspects of an axiological question sort of imply a sentient being, don't they? So do you think it's true to say it's completely possible to ask a how question without leaving in
To ask?
To ask an axiological question without leaving in the existence of a God?
Well, interestingly, no. There's a recent book actually, which precisely argues that it can be axiology without God, and there can be purpose in the universe without God. The name has just escaped me, but it's the person who invented the expression "a view from nowhere." Anybody remember what that name is? A well-known philosopher. Thomas Nagel. Yeah, Thomas Nagel. And he's Mind and the Cosmos, the book is called, Mind and the Cosmos. And he's argued that you can have purpose and axiology without God. The reason he says that is he doesn't like God. He doesn't like the God who we meet in churches, etc. He's Jewish, which is not irrelevant, full of course, problem of evil. Right? And so he doesn't want a personal God who's responsible for all this evil in the world. So he has reasons for not wanting to use the word God. But he does think axiology is, you can talk in vaguer terms about objective value in the universe. So it can be done.
Presumably he's wrong.
I think he's wrong, yes.
In the Old Testament, you've got the form Gideon, and he has fleeced before the Lord. He seemed to repeat the experiment 3 times successfully, and other people, maybe in this room, certainly people I know, have put fleeces before the Lord, and there seems to be an element of truth in that. And the other thing about Joseph's dream, when the Hodians and John were killed, it seemed to have reflected a truth about the dream. And so there are certain elements in the Testament and in the modern day similar things that occur which give an indication of verification.
Yeah, I think my response was that if God impels you to do that, if you believe that God is asking you to do this, then that would be okay. Yeah. But if you yourself test God and you set up an experiment that hasn't been divinely inspired, I think that would be really not a thing to do. So yeah. So I'm not discounting that God could say, I am going to do this, or God could say anything God wanted, presumably, and do it. And to a prophet, perhaps that would be true, but it wouldn't be used as a proof exactly. I think you'd need to look at those cases a bit more and say, is this an experimental proof, or is it something else? But there are those cases, yeah.
I'm just wondering if, when you talk about internal mental states and those being in a separate realm almost, whether there's a bit of a whiff of God of the gaps there, and if eventually brain scans could say you are dreaming about invisible unicorns, then that would have closed off. So is it a sort of philosophically distinct?
Well, I think that's just trying to make science do too much. To say that if natural science is the investigation of pure, then I think that it's not going to be, except by the sort of thing you can do. You could even, as you find out what brain states are occurring when, say, you are angry. In future, that person must be angry. You can do that sort of thing in a very general way. But it would be very odd to say that by inspecting Einstein's brain, you could discover the theory of relativity, which is implied in what you're saying, that one day science will be able to tell you all the theoretical knowledge you ever want to hope just by looking at somebody's brain. you think there's something logically awry there. In other words, I think there are correlations you'd expect to find between brain states and the content of the thoughts that you're having. There are correlations, but it's never going to amount to the ability to give direct, uninferred knowledge of the content of somebody's thoughts by just looking at their brains.
Following on from that, there are of course those who disagree.
Of course.
Peter Atkins is the
Peter Atkins.
perfect example. I mean,
Yes.
He says that when neuroscience is complete, he will be able to tell me why I know my wife.
Not surprisingly, I won't say that.
And it seems to me that it comes back to simply the worldview, that you either accept that or you don't. And my question is how to deal with this when I'm talking to my non-Christian friends who this sort of argument you've raised simply cut no ice. They just come back to saying, well, you're just wrong. And I find it very difficult to construct an argument that can even find a chink in their armour, because clearly I'm deluded. I mean, I'm obviously deluded and stupid.
Yeah, I think that's a cultural phenomenon, really, because really most people who've thought about this throughout history have just thought that there's no possibility that the materialist worldview could be true. It's just not on the agenda. When I was young, it wasn't on the agenda. People would have laughed. Philosophers in Oxford would have laughed at materialism in my lifetime. And amazingly, it's become fashionable. And you think, how could this have happened? And what's happening is that some very good philosophers are espousing materialism, but they're not pretending that they can show that it's true. They're just saying this would be a great bet. This would be a wonderful thing. E.O. Wilson, he wrote a book about this called Consilience. And in that book he says, look, what I'm saying, materialism, it's all reducible to material electrons and movements in the brain, etc. He said, I know this is skating on thin ice, but that's something I like to do. I think it's important to see the materialist hypothesis, which is very fashionable, is thin ice. I mean, it's just a bet on something that nobody's anywhere near doing. You know, respectable neuroscientists will admit that consciousness is what they call the hard problem. They have no idea of how you can explain consciousness in terms of brain states. No idea, not the slightest. So they're taking a huge bet. And I think what you've got to fasten on is just how little people know about this. Jim Al-Khalili last week on television was saying 95% of science is something we know nothing about. 95% not of science, 95% of the universe, dark energy, dark matter, is something we haven't got the slightest idea about. How can we say that we know that we get all that? Peter Atkins strikes me as lunatic. He said that about me, so I'm just getting my he says the opposite of what Jim Khalili said. Peter Atkins says the difference between science and faith is that scientists know that they can understand everything and they will understand everything. Whereas faith just says, oh, it's all a mystery, it must be God. But actually, it's scientists now who say it's all a mystery, we haven't got the slightest idea about it, and Jim Khalili said this on television. And I think you have to just say the immense amount of primitive thought in science is amazing. We don't know in the slightest how to interpret quantum physics. I go around asking all the physicists in my own college in Oxford, what about this? And do you know what they say to me? They say, it's not my field.
This lady next and then the lady at the back. So this lady first.
I just wanted to ask what your take is on the reality of people's experiences when they undergo stimulation of this famous G-spot in the brain,
Right.
and they have very vivid experiences of God sometimes, of angels, of the Virgin Mary, and it begs a lot of questions. Just wondered what your take is on that.
No, I have no problem with that. I'd be surprised if it didn't happen. There's a part of the brain which is the facial recognition area, and if you stimulate that, people will have visual appearances of faces. So we know that if you stimulate certain parts of the brain, that they're going to have visual appearances of faces. That's what they're going to have. That doesn't make you think there aren't any faces. That just makes you think that if you stimulate that part of the brain, they're going to see things like faces. Yeah. So it's the same with religious experience. You can stimulate a part of the brain and make people have an experience which they think they call religious. It's the sort of oceanic or supernatural to them in some way. But that doesn't mean there's no God, or they couldn't experience God. It just means you can replicate experiences rather like that by stimulating the appropriate part of the brain, which is just what you would expect.
They're authentic.
Well, if somebody stimulates your brain and you see faces, are those authentic? You're having experiences of faces, but there are no faces physically there. Authentic is not quite the right word. I mean, you say they're just having experiences of faces, but it doesn't make you say there are no faces. Right? That's the important thing.
Yeah.
So people can have experiences of a personal presence. That's what usually happens. They feel as if there's somebody there. And that doesn't mean there are no people. It's not surprising, really. Why do people get upset by that? You're not saying, I'm inventing God. You're saying, I'm giving you an experience which is rather like what you might have if you experienced God. And yeah, that's true. Yeah.
What about the reflection I heard? I can't believe in religion, it's not rational. How does the word rational fit in with the range of vocabulary you've used?
Well, I think it's... What does the word rational mean? I might talk about that this afternoon, actually, but just in a sentence now. I think to be reasonable is to look for as comprehensive and appreciative and critical a view of as many data as you can get hold of as you can, and that's a reasonable view. Reasonableness is what a judge looks for in assessing the innocence or guilt of somebody in a court of law. You can make reasonable judgments or unreasonable judgments. It's practical wisdom. There is no algorithm for it. There's no magic formula which will make you absolutely reasonable. Right. So reasonableness is just there can be reasonable religious people who take account of criticisms, try to respond to them, etc. And there can be unreasonable religious people who don't care about criticisms. Just
say reasonable, does that go with rational?
Yeah, I mean, there's no such thing as just abstract rationality. I think most psychologists now would agree that rationality is much more emotive than you might think. That it involves your deep feelings about things. So reason is not some thing that a computer could do. Computers aren't reasonable. They deduce things perfectly. Sometimes. But they're not reasonable. You call something reasonable. You say, is that a reasonable view? And it means, have you taken everything into account? Have you balanced things? Have you made an assessment? And a reasonable person will always know, here's a good test of a reasonable person, they will always know that some sensible person will disagree with them.
You've thrown around the term of common sense, and I've thought about this in my notes. What is common sense?
That's a very good question. I don't think you can define common sense really, but a lot of philosophers have called themselves common sense philosophers. And a lot of people say, I just believe what common sense tells me. So it could mean, one thing it could mean, I just believe what most people believe in my society, which is pretty relativistic. You say what they are there UFOs? Well, if I'm in a UFO society, yeah, that's common sense. I think in the 18th century, probably most people would have said it's common sense to believe in God. It's common sense, you don't need to argue it, it's just common sense. Now, in English society now, you probably say that's not a common sense belief. It's not a belief you'd hold without thinking, it's just obvious to you, it doesn't need an argument. I think that's what I mean by common sense. It's a very socially relative thing. So whatever most people take for granted, that's common sense.
So last question before we break.
Yeah, thanks. So following up on that question, you mentioned that science doesn't start with common sense. So I'm an oceanographer, and when I started in oceanography, this concept of Coriolis force and all that, geostrophy, these terms that we use in oceanography, it didn't seem like common sense to me at the time. But now, having done it a little bit, it's actually super common sense. So I kind of disagree with the statement that science doesn't start with common sense, because it
Well, I take a common sense view. My family is a farming family, all right? And if I think of when I was young and talking to them, they'd have just said, all this science stuff is, for eggheads. Common sense is you just get on with it, and if it works, you accept that it's true. Right? So a very non-intellectual, not curious intellectual attitude. So you don't try to look for underlying hidden forces which explains what happens. You just say, this is what happens. Right? That's common sense. It's what you get down the pub. Right? And it's usually wrong.
That's a good note to end this session. Thank you, Ian.